Our next speaker for today, we have Jayne Groll, co-founder and CEO. Jayne Groll is co-founder and CEO of the DevOps Institute, whose mission is to advance the human elements of DevOps. Her IT management career spans over 25 years of senior IT management roles across the wide range of industries. Her expertise spans multiple domains, including DevOps, Agile, ITIL, ITSM, and leadership. She is the author of the Agile Service Management Guide. Jayne is a recognized and respected IT thought leader and influencer, and she's very active in the global DevOps, ITSM, and Agile communities, and is also a frequent presenter at local, national, and virtual events. Her topic for today is engineering IT service management through site reliability engineering.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jayne Groll, CEO of the DevOps Institute, and I'm so delighted to be at the DevOps India Summit with you virtually this year, hopefully in the near future, in person again. And today we're going to talk about engineering IT service management through site reliability engineering. A little bit about me. I am co-founder and CEO of the DevOps Institute. I'm a former ITIL instructor. I was one of the principals in a US-based ITIL training company, ITSM Academy. A long time ago, I'm a former IT ops director. I get the privilege of speaking at conferences such as this, and I'm also the author of the Agile Service Management Guide. So I've got a fair amount of experience in the DevOps, the Agile, and particularly the IT service management space, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited about site reliability engineering and its approach to service management. If you're not familiar with DevOps Institute, our mission is to advance the human elements of DevOps. Our goal is to drive human transformation in this digital age. And we do that by providing a safe and interactive environment for our members. You can become a member of DevOps Institute at devopsinstitute.com. We have multiple levels of membership, including a free basic and a paid premium. You can learn a lot more about our benefits on our site. I hope you'll take advantage of that opportunity and become a part of our global member community. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to kind of level set in terms of what is site reliability engineering and take a look at some of the core principles that have emerged first out of the book written by several of Google's employees, and then look at it from a real world perspective. And then I really want to focus some of our time today looking at key ITSM practices and how SRE approaches, though. We're not going to be able to do a terribly deep dive, but I really would like to just introduce you to some of the ways that SRE approaches IT service management. We'll wrap up by looking at SRE in industry, and then hopefully I'll give you some ideas for getting started. So everyone knows that last year was a year of the unexpected. I don't think anybody expected a global pandemic and its impact on us both personally and professionally. And as we start to come out of it, there is what is now being called the next normal. It's not even the new normal, it's the next normal. And I think organizations and individuals learned a lot last year about how to pivot very quickly into a new landscape. In this case, because it was necessary, but I think going forward, we've got some lessons that we've got to embrace and continue. I like to think that the pandemic, despite all of the horrors, pushed us into the future, probably 3 to 5 years ahead of where we might have gotten there on our own. But one thing's pretty clear, and that's that digital transformation is no longer optional, right? Organizations that were able to pivot to more of a digital footprint over the past 18 months were more successful than those that really struggled with being able to appear in the digital world as opposed to in the physical world. But if you're going to be digital, you have to be reliable. And I think that's where the increased interest in site reliability engineering is coming from. I think, again, last year taught us a lot about the need for services to not only be available, but to also look at customer experience. And what does that mean in terms of what's the expectation, excuse me, of your customers? So let's start by just having a very, very high level look at site reliability engineering, right? Born out of the original book, which is now 5 years old, which is remarkable, written by some of the staff from Google in terms of how they were able to keep their very, very complex environment reliable. And so that launched a set of practices now known as SRE out of the original site reliability engineering book. It was then supplemented by the site reliability workbook, and then more recently, a book from O'Reilly about building secure and reliable systems. You can read these books for free on the Google site. There's some really interesting insight. It is fairly prescriptive in terms of some ways to handle very, very common practices. And Ben Trainer-Sloss, who I understand is speaking at this event, really defined it as SRE is what happens when you ask a software engineer to design an operations function. You know, to my mind, this really brought operations into center stage. And as somebody that comes from the operations space, you know, we always waited on the other side of the fence, you know, to see what was being thrown over. This really changes the relationship within the software development lifecycle because it is an engineering practice. Google considers SRE its approach to service management, and that's called out very clearly in the first Site Reliability Engineering book. Look at the definitions of an SRE team, particularly those of you who have experience with ITIL or IT service management. The SRE team is responsible for availability, latency, performance, efficiency, change management, monitoring, emergency response, and capacity planning of their service. Can you see the ITIL or the ITSM processes baked into those responsibilities? Things like capacity management, change management, incident management, right? We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. And then the rules are codified for how SRE teams interact with their environment. So they're not on the other side of the fence anymore, waiting to see what's being thrown over. They not only deal with production, but they work very closely with the product development teams, the testing teams, the users, right? They're a key part of the pre-production and post-production aspects of a service. So it's a little bit of a different approach than, for example, in my history, where, you know, operations was kind of the next stage, but those that came before really didn't interact with operations actively while a feature or product was being developed. So it's a little bit of a different twist. To my mind, it's the capstone element of a self-regulating software delivery system. So if you kind of look at the evolution, starting with agile software development, where we moved away from this linear waterfall approach, excuse me, and we started to iterate how software was being developed, and the teams, according to Scrum and according to the Agile Manifesto, really encouraged a self-managing, self-organizing team, right? Where the team was told what they needed to accomplish, but not how to do it. And then the team would figure it out on their own. And then, you know, kind of the next evolution came DevOps, right? So what came out of the software development teams now needed to go into the pre-production work of build, test, secure, and deploy. And also that was a self-regulating system as well, adopting a lot of automation for consistency and speed. But DevOps stopped at deployment, right? Everyone talks about continuous delivery, continuous deployment. And those of us in operations kind of wanted to stand on the mountain and shout, well, what now? When that code goes into production, what's changed, right? Is it exactly the same? And I think that's where SRE really plays its role, because it too is a self-regulating part of this system, where the site reliability engineer or the engineering team are encouraged to be able to be innovative, to be creative. So if you look at the alignment of Agile, DevOps, and now SRE, they are three pieces of the same puzzle, right? That are looking at speed, or looking at reliability, or are looking at observability. So they make collaboration more frequent and certainly more productive, and that has to improve the quality of the services. So having said that, let's take a very brief look at some of the principles behind SRE, because I think they also significantly impact how SRE approaches service management. Well, the guiding principles from a human perspective are really interesting, right? Service level objectives, not service level agreements, right? Not operational level agreements, no contracts at this point, right? But really creating objectives for service levels. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Managing service level objectives with consequences. So again, there's a certain amount of autonomy that's given once the SLOs are agreed to, and then are in practice, right? And then, as I said, it's a self-organizing approach, where the team has the ability to regulate their workload because they know what they have to achieve. They have to be able to meet or exceed the service level objectives. So there's a certain amount of empowerment that goes with that. The best part about SRE as a role is that the job is tasked with spending half their time doing reactive work, but the other half of their time doing proactive work. It may be looking at ways to automate toil, that manual, repetitive work, but the team has to be given time to make tomorrow better than today. And then, as with Agile, as with DevOps, as with ITIL, as with most frameworks, continuous learning is essential. And so failure is an opportunity to improve, and looking at things like blameless postmortems, that the team actually takes time to understand how they can improve, and how failure is an opportunity to improve. So from a human aspect, those are the key SRE principles. But then if you look at the guiding principles from more of a operational or technical perspective, it takes it down to a little bit of a different level. First of all, we have to understand and embrace risk, intelligent risk, of course. And that's part of the innovation of working with the development teams, the DevOps teams, because risk is understood, right? There's a pervasive amount of testing that goes into services, but if we're managing service level objectives, and we understand that 100% is not possible, right? That there is a certain amount of risk that's associated with any service, then we have to embrace that. And we also have to manage that risk intelligently, because everything is based on those service level objectives, right? If the service level objectives are being met, or if they're breached, right, then that changes the behavior of everybody, from the developers all the way through to the operations team. So the service level objectives really give the team a shared sense of accountability and a shared sense of goals. Of course, monitoring has to be a key element of this. There's some new practices that are emerging in observability, which takes monitoring to a different level, still embraces the idea of event management and monitoring, but is important. And so if we're going to meet those service level objectives, if we're going to embrace risk, then we also have to look at eliminating toil. And you know what toil is, right? Toil is that work that everybody hates to do. It's the manual, repetitive, redundant, day-to-day things that you wish were automated. And so in SRE, the goal is to automate as much toil as possible and to eliminate unnecessary toil. my team at DevOps Institute, calls it from Toil Town to Automation Nation. And I think that's a very cute way of looking at it, right? Toil Town, the town nobody wants to be in. Automation Nation, where we're really starting to embrace the tools to be more consistent and to be able to do a lot of the repetitive work. Despite all of that, we also want to stay simple. We don't want SRE practices to become bureaucratic, to become complex, to become difficult to understand. And then, of course, the last principle is to engineer releases, because if releases are engineered well, and that's a key part of DevOps, it's now a key part of DevSecOps, certainly an aspect of site reliability engineering. If the release is done well, then the ability to keep that service reliable in production increases. So again, if we're going to look at reliability as the key to achieving service level objectives, right? And so it isn't necessarily availability, it isn't necessarily capacity, it's all of the above, right? It's really looking at the reliability of those services, what your customer experiences are and what your customers expect. We still have to manage services, right? ITSM is still very, very relevant because there's so many aspects to a service that have to be managed. In my mind, SRE is the most innovative approach to ITSM since the early days of ITIL. I'm an old ITIL service manager. Nothing wrong with ITIL 4. I think that ITIL 4 has certainly adopted some new ways to adapt to the digital environment. And I don't want to do a comparison of SRE to ITIL. I think that's unfair. I think both stand on their own. And I also think there are practices from both that could be adopted and adapted. But in terms of innovative approaches, I do think SRE is a very innovative approach to IT service management. And as I said, Google very clearly calls it out as its approach to service management. A lot of the practices and processes are very familiar if you come from an IT service management background. Service management under SRE has to be a system that's lightweight, right? That is just enough process, right? Just enough guidance. To be able to maintain its ability to be self-organizing. Has to be integrated with other practices. As I said, it has to be self-regulating, has to be very inclusive, right? So it breaks down some of those silo walls. The accountability is the service level objectives, automated as much as possible, and a lot of proactive work. That's why the SRE role is tasked with half their time. To be able to eliminate toil and make tomorrow better than today. It's really about systems engineering for service management, right? So if we're looking at how do we engineer the system known as service management, right? If you're familiar with ITIL 4, right, the service management system, it is looking at taking an engineering approach to that. Some of these practices should be very familiar to you if you come from an ITIL or ITSM background. If not, they're familiar to you because you are either engaged in these processes or perhaps are a customer of these processes. But I want to take a few minutes and just take a really high-level look at familiar processes and how SRE approaches them. And let's start with service level management. In the early days of ITIL, you would see these roadmaps and you would see companies that would say, well, year 1, we're going to do incident management. Year 2, we'll do change management. Year 3, we'll do service level management. Well, in SRE, that can't be, right? The very first step has to be to define at least base service level objectives, right? What's the objective for the product, for the feature? I mean, you can granulate SLOs down however you want, but for our sake, let's look at it at the service level, right? What are the objectives for this service? What are the latency? What's the performance, capacity, availability? How do we know what the customer experience is? How do we know that we're meeting these objectives? And so, of course, SLOs have to be something that everybody understands, including the customers, right? And they're never 100%. So there's a negotiation. It's not a service level agreement, but there's a negotiation. And then we measure the SLOs through discrete service level indicators. You could call them key performance indicators. You could look at it from a application or a component level, right? But you manage to the SLOs, but you measure by the SLIs. Now, SLAs got a little overloaded, and the definition of a service level agreement has taken on so many different contexts that SRE steps away. It addresses SLAs, but avoids the legal aspect of SLAs, where it's more important to get the signature than really understanding what the objective is. So, and that's why you'll hear a lot more about SLOs than SLAs in service level, in SRE. Now, change management takes on a kind of a new spin, and it's one of my favorites. If you understand what your SLOs are, and you understand that, you know, nothing is 100%, then the teams are issued an error budget, which means they're given a certain amount of leeway to embrace risk, right? To embrace intelligent risk. And by managing to an error budget, and knowing that the error budget is actually meant to be spent, right? We want to be innovative. We want to be able to adopt new practices that, and again, everybody shares this common understanding of the error budget, that if you're starting to reach the threshold of your error budget, you're probably going to change some of your releases. You're probably going to change some of your testing, right? But the error budget tells us a lot about how the teams are going to organize, because they're self-organizing, right? So there's a lot of autonomy that's built into that. Of course, there's automation that's embraced as well, but at the end of the day, we can really start to increase the velocity of our releases, because frankly, as long as the team is within their error budget, they can pretty much release at will, and not have to go through a change advisory board or a change approval board. They're given that ability and the accountability to be able to do that. It also kind of removes humans in a lot of ways, because we want to automate as much as possible. And so it puts the people that are responsible for the change to be as close to it as possible. And it avoids some of the problems of bureaucracy or fatigue. Now, event management, again, as I said before, we're still monitoring. There's no doubt about it. And what we're monitoring is pretty familiar. But a new practice is emerging known as observability, where everyone, developers, DevOps teams, SREs, others, are really able to observe the service, both from an internal and an external perspective. So yes, they could look at the thresholds for the infrastructure. They could look at the performance of the latency of the site. They can look at traffic, right? They can look at all that, but they also can observe the customer experience. They can observe, you know, throughput. They can observe transaction times. They can observe what's actually, how this service is being consumed. So again, I can't spend a lot of time today telling you a lot about observability, but I would encourage you to do some research about some of the practices that are emerging around observability. There's some new tools, but the best part about it is developers observe, DevOps teams observe, operations observes. So it's really a communal event, and I think really fascinating. Capacity management was one of those practices within ITIL that I think was confusing, only because we did not necessarily understand who was responsible for capacity planning. There was the capacity plan, there was forecasting, right? There was all of that, but there really wasn't an accountability. Well, in SRE, the SRE team is absolutely in charge of capacity planning and provisioning. So it puts the accountability into those that are actually kind of seeing how capacity is used. It looks at organic growth, right? Natural usage of the service, and then event-driven or inorganic growth, and can start to forecast based on metrics that are associated with both types of capacity. You know, in today's very elastic world, having a team like an SRE team who is talented and trained to be able to really study capacity usage and provision as necessary, I think is essential if you're going to be digital. Incident management, again, takes on a little bit of a different spin. There's a lot of talk in SRE about the wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and trying to avoid some of the things that might require somebody being awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning. The SRE is on call, serves the role of, say, level 2, level 3, but is also has the skills. It may be scripting skills, maybe coding skills, has enough deep technical knowledge to be able to resolve some of these incidents themselves. And of course, some of the practices avoid the 2 o'clock in the morning call because of things that happen during the day that could be resolved at, say, 6 or 7 o'clock at night as opposed to 2 o'clock in the morning. For major incidents, one of the things I really like about how SRE approaches incident management is by creating an incident command system. Again, I ran help desks for a long time. And sometimes when a major incident occurred, you felt like you were managing by running around, right? And so you would have these escalation paths and you would have, tickets that were being routed and then they'd be rerouted. Here, there's a commander that is predefined, depending on the type of incident that it is. There's a very recognized command post. There's a living state document. Could be a ticket in a ITSM tool, but the ticket is less important than the knowledge that's being shared. Could be a Google Doc, right? That goes into a ticketing system later, but it is a shared understanding of the state of the incident as it's happening. Handoffs are very clear, they're live, right? Again, the commander is really assigning those responsibilities and removing those roadblocks. And as I said, SREs also spend a significant amount of time on call. But again, there's a hierarchy that's baked into incident management. And of course, triaging incidents so that you understand who it should get routed to. Of course, this doesn't negate the need for a service desk. It just creates it at the higher levels when we start to get to level 2s and level 3s. And then problem management, again, takes a very medical approach, very similar to maybe what you've seen in ITIL, where there's a problem report, there's triaging, examining, diagnosing, testing, treating, and curing. Again, it's a medical approach to removing the root cause. But the key, I think, part of SRE culture, and SRE is as cultural as it is a process framework, is blameless postmortems, where we look at incidents, we look at troubleshooting, we don't indict anyone or any team, we collaborate on trying to figure out what went wrong and how we can fix this in the future. So it's a very collaborative, very blameless approach to incident and problem management. So again, those are familiar ITSM practices and a little bit of a taste in terms of how SRE approaches that. SRE covers a lot more: software engineering and SRE, security, load balancing, right? The cultural aspects of communication and collaboration, managing operational load. So I do encourage you, read the books. I'll tell you at the end, DevOps Institute has an SRE foundation certification, a practitioner coming out, a partner like Excelantro is delivering that regionally. So we'll talk a little bit more, but there's a lot more to SRE than just the practices that I described. So here's the question, particularly for those of you from the ITSM community. Isn't it more technical than traditional ITSM? Sure. There's a durable focus on engineering, but engineering is a mentality, right? It's systems engineering. So first you have to engineer your system and then replicate it in automation. Yes, the number one skill for an SRE is Python. Well, if a 13-year-old can learn Python, I figure I can too, right? So we want to reduce toil and we want to have time to innovate and upskill, but you have to have intelligent process if you're going to look at having intelligent automation. SRE is on the rise. DevOps Institute does an annual report, and site reliability engineering as a hireable role is just growing year over year over year. Enterprises are embracing the role. They're really starting to embed SREs into their team. And if you look at SRE as a real job, there are over 10,000 posted jobs in the US for SREs, Most are paying over $100,000. So again, it's an area that there's great need. And I think if you come from systems administration, operations, infrastructure, as software engineering, right? A lot of software engineers are becoming SREs. I think that's really important. So with that, I really want to thank my friend Niladri, ex-Cilantro, DevOps India Summit, for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about SRE with you. As I said, DevOps Institute introduced an SRE Foundation certification. Our friends at ex-Cilantro are delivering it virtually in the region. An SRE practitioner is coming out later this year. We think this is an important set of skills for anyone that's involved in operations, anyone involved in development or security, because I think there's a collaborative cultural element to this that's essential. So on that note, I thank everyone at DevOps India Summit, and I'm Jayne Groll. I'm CEO of the DevOps Institute, and wishing you a really great event.